photo was later given to the Western press by Colonel Dr. Marina Popovich, a Russian astronaut and pilot who has long been interested in UFOs. Phobos, one of the 2 moons of Mars, has itself always been considered a rather mysterious object, as has its smaller twin, Deimos. Josef Shklovsky, a noted member of the Soviet Academy of Science and co-writer with the famous Dr. Carl Sagan of Intelligent Life in the Universe, once calculated from the estimated density of the Martian atmosphere and the peculiar acceleration of Phobos that the satellite must be hollow. Could Phobos be a hollowed-out space station of huge proportions? The question, as you will find out, is not so far from reality as you might first think. In July 1988, the Russians sent 2 unmanned satellite probes called Phobos 1 and Phobos 2 in the direction of Mars, with the primary intention of investigating the planet's mysterious moon, Phobos. The first probe, Phobos 1, was unfortunately lost en route 2 months earlier, reportedly because of a radio command error. Phobos 2 was also ultimately then lost in the most intriguing circumstances, but not before it had beamed back certain images and information from the planet Mars itself. Phobos 2 arrived safely at Mars in January 1989 and entered into orbit around Mars as the first step at its destination towards its ultimate goal, to transfer to an orbit that would make it fly almost in tandem with the Martian moon called Phobos, hence the spacecraft's name. All went well until the probe aligned itself with Phobos, the Martian moon. Then on the 28th of March 1989, the Soviet Mission Control Center acknowledged sudden communication problems with the spacecraft, and TASS, the official Soviet news agency, responded that Phobos 2 failed to communicate with Earth as scheduled after completing an operation yesterday around the Martian moon Phobos. Scientists at Mission Control have been unable to establish stable radio contact. What had caused the Phobos 2 spacecraft to be lost? The answer came about 3 months later. Pressed by their international participants in the Phobos missions to provide more definitive data, the Soviet authorities released the taped television transmission Phobos 2 sent in its last moments, except for the last frames, taken just seconds before the spacecraft fell silent. The television clip was shown by some TV stations in Europe and Canada as part of weekly diary programs, as a curiosity and not as a hot news item. The television sequence thus released focused on 2 anomalies. The first was a network of straight lines in the area of the Martian equator. Some of the lines were short, some longer, some thin, some wide enough to look like rectangular shapes embossed in the Martian surface. Arranged, narrow lines parallel to each other, the pattern covered an area of some 600 square kilometers, more than 230 square miles. The anomaly appeared to be far from a natural phenomenon. The television clip was accompanied by a live comment by Dr. John Becklake of the London Science Museum. He described the phenomenon as very puzzling because the pattern seen on the surface of Mars was photographed not with the spacecraft's optical camera, but with its infrared camera, a camera that takes pictures of objects using the heat they radiate, and not by the play of light and shadow on them. In other words, the pattern of parallel lines and rectangles covering an area of almost 250 square miles was a source of heat radiation. It is highly unlikely that a natural source of heat radiation, a geyser or a concentration of radioactive minerals under the surface, for example, would create such a perfect geometric pattern. When viewed over and over again, the pattern definitely looks artificial, but as for what it was, the scientist said, "I certainly don't know." According to Boris Belitsky, science correspondent for Radio Moscow, just before contact was lost with Phobos 2, several unusual images were radioed back to Earth, described by the Russian as quite remarkable features. A report taken from New Scientist of 8th of April 1989 describes the following. The features are either on the Martian surface or in the lower atmosphere. The features are between 20 and 25 kilometers wide and do not resemble any known geological formation. They are spindle-shaped and proving to be intriguing and puzzling. Since no coordinates for the precise location of this anomalous feature have been released publicly, It is impossible to judge its feature on the surface of Mars that can be seen in Mariner 9 frame 4209-75. It is also located in the equatorial area at longitude 186.4 and has been described as unusual indentations with radial arms protruding from a central hub, caused, according to NASA scientists, by the melting and collapse of permafrost layers. The design of the features bringing to mind the structure of a modern airport, with a circular hub from which the long structures housing the airplane gates radiate can be better visualized when the photograph is reversed, showing depressions as protrusions. A shadow across the surface of Mars. An unusual photo of a thin shadow across Mars was shown on the Russian television segment. Seen on the surface of Mars was a clearly defined dark shape that could indeed be described, as it was in the initial dispatch from Moscow, as a thin ellipse. It was certainly different from the shadow of Phobos, recorded 18 years earlier by Mariner 9. The latter cast a shadow that was a rounded ellipse and fuzzy at the edges, as would be cast by the uneven close-up view of Phobos, showing the grooved and cratered surface. The anomaly seen in the Phobos 2 transmission was a thin ellipse with very sharp rather than rounded points. The shape is known in the diamond trade as marquise, and the edges, rather than being fuzzy, stood out sharply against a kind of halo on the Martian surface. Dr. Becklake described it as something that is between the spacecraft and Mars, because we can see the Martian surface below it, and stressed that the object was seen both by the optical and the infrared heat-seeking camera. All these reasons explain why the Soviets have not suggested that the dark, thin ellipse might have been the shadow of the Moon. While the image was held on the screen, Dr. Becklake explained that it was taken as the spacecraft was aligning itself with Phobos, the Moon. As the last picture was halfway through, he said they, the Soviets, saw something which should not be there. The Soviets, he went on to state, have not yet released this last picture, and we won't speculate on what it shows. So what was it that collided or crashed into Phobos 2? Was the space probe shot out of space for seeing too much? What does the last secret frame show? In his careful words to Aviation Week and Space Technology, the chairman of the Soviet equivalent of NASA referred to that last frame, saying, "One image appears to include an odd-shaped object between the spacecraft and Mars." The highly secret photo was later given to the Western press by Colonel Dr. Marina Popovich, a Russian astronaut and pilot who has long been interested in UFOs. At a UFO conference in 1991, Popovich gave to certain investigators some interesting information that she smuggled out of the now ex-Soviet Union. Part of the information was what has been called the first ever leaked account of an alien mothership in the solar system. The last transmission from Phobos 2 was a photograph of a gigantic cylindrical spaceship, a huge, approximately 20 kilometers long, 1.5 kilometers diameter cigar-shaped mothership that was photographed on the 25th of March 1989 hanging or parked next to the Martian moon Phobos by the Soviet unmanned probe Phobos 2. After the last frame was radio transmitted back to Earth, the probe mysteriously disappeared. According to the Russians, it was destroyed, possibly knocked out with an energy pulse beam. The cigar-shaped craft in the penultimate frame, taken by Phobos 2, is apparently the object casting the oblong shadow on the surface of Mars in the earlier photo. Australian science writer Arian Crowley says that because of the convex cat's-eye shadow, which because the overhead solar inclination prevented shadow casting by Martian surface features, implies a shadow thrown on the surface by something in orbit beyond the orbit of Phobos 2 itself. The shadow spindle, or cigar-shaped, is inconsistent with any possible shadow cast by the moon Phobos, which is an irregular potato shape. One needs little imagination to postulate a giant hovering cigar-shaped mothercraft similar to those documented down the years by UFO investigators. Another Phobos picture, released on Canadian TV, presents an infrared scan radiometer image of the Martian surface that showed clearly defined rectangular areas. These were interconnected, with a set of perfectly straight channels much resembling a city block. There were no corresponding surface features taken by regular cameras. This suggests the heat signature of what may be a set of underground caverns and channels that are just too geometrically regular to be formed naturally. According to Dr. John Becklake of the London Science Museum, the city light pattern is 60 kilometers wide and could easily be mistaken for an aerial view of Los Angeles. Could there be an underground base on the small Martian moon? Is Phobos just an engineered asteroid, superheated and then, like a glass blower's blowglass, the moon inflated? Just who or what is occupying Mars and its planets? We are still no closer to finding those answers.